Bill Maher was recently pressed by a fellow comic, DeStefano, on The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and this conversation started out brilliant and potentially took a left turn.
I'm reading The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's convincing evidence.
What do you think? I throw people out of the club here? We believe in whatever you want.
I didn't. I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
I mean, he's right. He's 100% right.
That's crazy.
He's 100% right. And I just had a conversation with Derek from Myth Vision about this exact topic, and he conceded that majority of scholars, secular, not secular, atheist, agnostic, whatever, all agree that Jesus existed.
Yep.
At this point. Now, there are some on the fringes that still believe in the myth nonsense, but generally speaking, everybody agrees that Jesus existed, which is, I don't think that's Bill Maher's position.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming. In fact, it's always...
Read Case for Christ.
Yeah,
Give it a shot by Lee Strobel.
This is based on what? Archaeological finds?
Archaeological finds,
New ones?
theological finds, Ivy League.
What are theological finds?
Bill, ready for this?
Okay, so this is where it starts going left right away. Theological finds?
Well, here's the thing.
Theology is a study of God.
Yeah. Here's the thing.
So I love
this man's he's cooking.
I love his heart. I love him bringing this up. DeStefano, shout out to you, man. But you start just kind of saying words, and it goes off the rails because I could tell he hasn't finished the book.
He's got a few chapters left.
And two, he hasn't really processed the information.
Yeah.
And so Bill is able to just. This is what happens in a conversation like this: is when we're talking about something, someone that knows a little bit more than you, they'll just start reciting random things to you, right? And so he'll say a bunch of different things without you, like, because you got to stop and unpack every single thing.
Yep.
And Bill just throws a bunch of things at him, which are pretty much all nonsense.
If I told you factual evidence about Alexander the Great, you would believe me.
Okay, but even still, it's a silly point because who cares if Jesus lived? It's whether he's then died and was reborn and is up in heaven with his Father, who's really him.
Okay.
That's the part where the rubber meets the road. Maybe he existed. I agree. That's absolutely possible. He may have existed.
But according to Case for Christ, independent sources who didn't know each other, who wrote about him within 20 years of his death, talked about these miracles happening as in real time.
Okay. Well, again.
And Alexander the Great's biographers, the earliest one was like 100 years after he died.
He's
I
cooking.
love how passionate he is about it.
I love it. And he's right. Everything he said right there is right, is that they are written within his 20 years. Some of the oldest gospels are within 20 years.
Yep.
Every other figure from history and every other story has less manuscripts and is written way after their death. Except with Jesus, everything is written, within 50, 60 years of his death and resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
I have to burst your bubble now because here's I have to spit a couple of facts at you that are kind of under. Okay.
It's Hollywood.
There's only two sources.
Spit in my mouth.
He said, "Spit in my mouth." It's Hollywood.
Well,
that was a good joke.
In the Bible. There's the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay. There's also another guy, Josephus, who wasn't accepted, but read the Case for Christ.
Not in the Bible.
Josephus.
Okay.
But the Bible is itself an anthology. They found some few decades ago the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
which were other books that were just basically edited out. So right away we know a person decided what constituted the Bible and just
So now you see how many claims he made?
Yeah.
The Dead Sea Scrolls had books that were edited out.
There's only two resources in the entire Bible.
Dead Sea Scrolls had books that were edited out. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls found primarily Old Testament stuff. Let's look this up. See, and this is the issue with conversations like this. And now we got to stop and look up every single thing because I heard that and went, I don't think that's right, Bill. I don't think the Dead Sea Scrolls rolled out stuff.
The cave contained fragments of about 31 scrolls, mostly written on papyrus, including biblical works: Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, 1 Kings, Psalm, Daniel, etc.
So right away, you notice what's happening. He's trying to talk about the New Testament. Bill says the Dead Sea Scrolls threw out a bunch of other books. Let's just say Enoch was in there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just for the sake of argument. That's apocryphal literature. Enoch is not viewed as inspired, but is viewed as like, this is good. And so this is why the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox have Enoch in their canon. I believe all of them have Enoch in their canon. Protestants, we don't. And depending on who you talk to, they're going to say, Martin Luther threw out the Apocrypha, and other people are going to say, no, it's neither here nor there. The conversation that he was trying to have was about the existence of Jesus and the documentation of Jesus's life. Because if you documented his life right, and the New Testament is right, that means he really lived, he really committed, he really did miracles, he really committed blasphemy, he really claimed to be the Son of God, and he really got crucified for it. And then the tomb was really empty.
Yeah.
Which I think everyone, including Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic textual critic who doesn't believe in Jesus, all align and agree on that.
Some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor.
I get it. Council of Nicaea. I get it.
Council of Nicaea, yes.
And so now we just start saying buzzwords. Now this is like Council of Nicaea did not have anything to do with any of this. Like,
Yeah. Well, I think Bill Maher doesn't know what he's saying with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
at all.
I think he's alluding to what he heard about the Council of Nicaea, not actually researched about the Council of Nicaea. And then Chris is making the correlation between what Bill Maher is actually talking about and the Council of Nicaea. And by acknowledging what he knows Bill Maher is trying to talk about, I think he's actually saying, yeah, that's actually nothing to be worried about, which is also true, if that makes sense.
Yeah, except when people bring up Council of Nicaea in this tone, it sounds like he's saying, and then the Council of Nicaea created the Trinity, and then the Council of Nicaea, right? And that's not what happened at the Council of Nicaea. Maybe he's not saying it that way. Maybe I'm reading into it.
No, because I mean, the claim at the Council of Nicaea is that they edited the Bible.
Sure.
So
Or they made Jesus God, or they confirmed the Trinity.
Yeah.
All these other things.
Yeah, but he was saying in reference to him cutting out books.
Yeah, gotcha.
So I think he's like
325 AD.
Yes.
That's when they decided the Christian religion. I agree with you.
Right.
That's when they
I'm
decided
with you
the
on that.
Christian
I remember that.
religion.
Well, he's freestyle.
But I'm telling you, read this book.
That's Emperor Constantine.
Shout out Constantine, Turkey, all that.
Well, the first one.
Constantinople.
The first one to change the Roman Empire to a Christian empire.
They decided all the
Took
holidays.
3 centuries.
I get it. And
Okay.
listen, Bill,
But-
I'm with you on that.
But here's the important point.
Let's do it.
There's only these 5 sources.
Hold on, pause it. Guys,
Come on,
people, Bill Maher people, if you're watching this, which maybe you are,
you're fired.
you guys got to fix this camera angle. Why is there a wall in the frame like that?
And cutting off the host's face.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Good boys.
Not contemporaries of Jesus. Not even close.
Based on what?
Not even close.
John and Matthew were disciples.
No. Mm-mm.
Mark, many believe, was who traveled with Peter. So they believe Mark is written from the perspective of Peter, right? Luke was hired by Theophilus to go and investigate all this from eyewitness accounts. And so Luke writes the Gospel of Luke, writes Acts, and then joins Paul on his missionary journeys. So what based on what? Like this is so Luke is documenting things that we know because as eyewitnesses, because we know that Luke was in contact with Paul, and Paul was in contact with Peter, and so Luke may have been around Peter. So you're saying like, what did he say? They're not contemporaries?
He said they're not contemporaries.
Contemporaries meaning they lived at the same time.
Yeah, or even know Jesus.
Yeah,
personally.
that's insane. So you could argue that for Mark and Luke, maybe, but you can't argue that for Matthew and John.
Yeah.
They lived from 70 to 110 years after him.
I understand.
No.
Based on what? He said 70 to 100 years after him?
He's getting the whole thing of like when the certain gospels were written confused with when the authors were born.
Right.
Like they weren't born 70 years after.
Yes.
They were written 50 to 70 years after. It's a big difference.
Big difference. And I think he's pulling this stuff probably from the Jesus Seminar scholars, quote unquote, who all believe in later gospel accounts. And the reason we just have Frank Turek on, the reason why we don't hold to those views, and he said that he investigated why they hold such later dates is just because they don't want the gospels to be true. Like it's really that simple, because if the gospels are true and they're historical and they're reliable, well, then that forces people to have to deal with the resurrection or at least the empty tomb, right? Because if the gospels are reliable, then you have to deal with the empty tomb, and there's no weaseling your way out of the empty tomb. So just pushing the dates further and further back, and then but making critical mistakes like this, like he's making really, really, really bad mistakes. On top of which, the gospels being written that late, just inaccurate on the sense of the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and if any of those were written before 70 AD, I mean maybe the caveat of John or maybe the caveat of Revelation. But it just doesn't add up. Like his timeline doesn't add up, because if the temple was destroyed, surely that would have been in the literature that was being written, because that was a catastrophic event to the Jewish people.
From 40 to 70 years after.
But they got their information from Josephus, who lived about 10 years after Jesus.
No, he
so
didn't.
already
No,
we're
they
into a
didn't.
game of telephone.
No, they didn't. And again, how did you come to that conclusion? Based on what? And have you ever considered a different perspective? That's the questions Turk gave me today, Frank Turk. Shout out to Frank.
That's fire.
Yeah.
That's fire. Yeah, I think so. This is the interesting thing, is that like this is probably the most biblically and historically literate person Bill Maher has ever debated on this topic, and that's saying a lot.
That's saying a lot.
Like this dude barely has
just
finished
read the Case for
Christ
Yeah.
and doesn't even follow Jesus like that yet. Maybe he does. Maybe he
Yes.
does after this. He's picking apart in a very sloppy way people that barely know this topic, and probably going back to his house being like, oh, I debate everyone on Jesus and I crush them.
Yeah.
And then because DeStefano is new to this whole thing, I think he holds his own pretty well for not knowing much and like just engaging in this stuff. But he then goes and starts to engage with arguments against Jesus that aren't even arguments, like this one we're about to watch.
The game of telephone, yes, I agree with you at that point. But the game of telephone in Jesus' times, according to Lee Strobel in the case of Christ, was the simple fact of we're playing the game of telephone. There's 10 people here. The game of telephone, as we know it today, is you say something in my ear and then it goes around 10 times. And by the time it gets to you, it's something radically different. This game of telephone, this ancient game of telephone was, but you tell it to me, then the third guy confirms what you said before it goes to the fourth guy. So there's a level of checking, checks and balances.
Chris, you're working too hard.
He just dismissed him.
He just dismissed him. But this is my point, is that like he said that the gospels are all from a game of telephone. Then Chris gives a real rebuttal to the idea of how their telephone game actually worked back in the ancient times, which people like do dunk on oral tradition, when in reality oral tradition is actually very reliable. But he's doing it out of context. He's feeding into the machine out of context, where like he gave Bill Maher the point that the gospels are written from oral tradition, and like, no, there are contemporaries.
Right.
So you already gave up that ground, and then you're debating about this thing. And I'm not saying this is Chris's fault, but this is what makes Bill feel like he's like all powerful. You know what I'm saying? Because he's engaging with people that aren't studied on this stuff, but then thinks he's winning. Yeah, and then also dismissive when they make a good point.
It's hubris and dismissive. You don't really understand where the scholars are currently, and then it's also like, well, you tell me something I don't know, so I'm just going to dismiss it and make light of it. And that's not really I would like to see Bill Maher actually engage with someone a bit more sophisticated. But again, props to Chris, major props to Chris for stepping up.
If you want to believe this, believe it. You don't have to convince me or
I'm just convincing you of case of Christ.
Or construct this scaffolding to which you hang this belief. Just believe it. It's all good. Okay. But
don't come to me, and when you die at St. Peter's, I'm not getting you in.
But you know, I can't go there with you. It's just, you know, it's silly. And
well, I'm just saying, it's nice the idea to believe in something. I'm just trying.
St. Paul.
Good guy, St. Paul, a.k.a. Saul, and the capital of Minnesota.
Is the other source of the Bible.
Yes.
There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I said the two names out of order because that's the order in the Bible. The first gospel, Mark, is 70 AD. Jesus dies in 33. So that's 40 years almost after he died.
Okay.
So not contemporaries. Paul comes before the gospel writers. He's writing around the year 50. In the 50s.
Okay.
So he's much closer to Jesus's time. So you'd think he would know more about Jesus than the people who came later, but actually St. Paul knows almost nothing about Jesus. He barely conceives of him as something that, as a person who lived on earth. There's no details about his life like they are in the Gospels. So the people who came later know more than the person who wrote earlier. Just some food for thought.
Paul wasn't writing an autobiography on Jesus. Paul was writing to churches and telling and answering questions that churches were having. That's literally all the books of Paul are, pretty much answering questions and issues they're having. So you're just making a categorical error thinking that Paul was writing an autobiography when he clearly wasn't. 2, Paul is reciting in 1 Corinthians 15 the earliest creed, which is talking about Jesus dying for the sins and resurrecting, all these things. So Paul very early on confirms and affirms a creed that could have been easily debunked because there were so many people still alive. He's saying, you know, within 20 years, I would say earlier, but either way, when you're saying this man's showing up to 500 people, Luke is writing that he was on earth for 40 days after and showed up to 500 people. This is all written within the time that people were still alive and could have easily dismissed this and debunked this.
Yeah.
He's just making a very bad categorical error on this.
Yeah. I mean, you know, when this whole video starts with him saying, first of all, I would like to see the evidence for Jesus existing because everything I've seen says the complete opposite.
Right.
It's like, okay. And then a few seconds later concedes that Jesus probably did exist.
Right.
It's like, he's just freestyling.
Yeah. Yeah. He's winning it, which is cool. Like, I'm glad the conversations are happening.
Yeah.
He does acknowledge at some point, right? Paul, a.k.a. Saul, knows that Jesus existed. He talks about him.
He talks about, I'm saying he conceives him as a Godhead. He doesn't have this, it's not the narrative that's in the Gospels of Jesus went around and he did miracles and he did stuff. And
It's not the narrative.
He totally missed the point of Jesus doing the miracles, which was that Jesus is part of the Godhead.
That's it. Jesus is God.
He's like, Paul talked about Jesus being God, not what the Gospels talk about, which is Jesus doing miracles and being God.
Right. Yeah. Oh man, gosh.
It's so bad.
And he gets quoted a lot. He makes speeches. Blessed are the meek. You know, he has adventures. He goes into the desert. It's a whole thing.
But what about?
And then at the end, it's a whole drama with, you know, he's crucified. Oh no, Paul doesn't know any of this. All the stuff that the gospel writers obsess about.
This is just inaccurate. Like this is just it's just flat out inaccurate. 1 Corinthians 15:3. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. So this is. Well, Paul passed on to the church. Remember, this church is already established. This is one of the earlier books written. Paul is saying he passed this on as first importance. So what is he about to do right now? He's going to recite a creed that they all know, that people around this time knew, that Christ died for our sins, according to the scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the scripture, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born, meaning that Paul was the younger one. So Paul is telling you the very thing that Bill Maher just said he never said, which is that Jesus died for our sins. Jesus resurrected. He appeared to all these people, and at one point over 500 people, and all these people, for the most part, are still alive, though a few have fallen. A few of them passed on.
He's stating these things in sort of like common knowledge.
Yeah. I passed this on to you as a first importance.
We all know this.
Yeah. Some scholars believe 1 Corinthians is really 2 Corinthians, that there was a letter before 1 Corinthians.
Oh, sure.
And then there was 2 Corinthians, which would have been 3 Corinthians, because they kept doing the same. They kept being sexually immoral and kept wilding out, right? So, man. So kind of a L for Bill Maher here.
Bill Maher.
W for Chris for attempting to engage and having these conversations. I think is super cool. And I hope, more conversations like this happen. We see, according to the Bible, that prayer is extremely important in terms of us being transformed from the inside out when we get aligned with God's will. For the Christians watching this channel, I want you guys to implement these spiritual disciplines in your day-to-day life. And the only way I've been able to do this consistently is through writing down my prayers in a prayer journal that does a few things. One, it allows me to reflect and come to God humbly and ask him to move on my behalf. And 2, it allows me to document my prayers, which ultimately help me remember the very things that I was praying for and see the hand of God tangibly in my life when he answers them. So I would urge you, consider writing down your prayers. It could be in a blank notebook. It could even be on your phone. Or you could check out the one I personally designed and used from my own quiet time and spiritual discipline that I think will be a huge blessing. It's the exact structure and system that I've used for years to pray and be more consistent in my spiritual disciplines. You can pick yours up today by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.